In a previous video, we learned that we cannot have a radical in the denominator. We could not have radical 3 in the denominator. So we learned that you can multiply by radical 3 over radical 3, do a little bit of work, and we call this rationalizing the denominator. But the very last problem, I did a problem, or I attempted to do a problem, with a binomial in the denominator. Two terms with a plus or a minus in it. And I tried to multiply it by radical 2 over radical 2, and it didn't work. My radical did not go away. So, we're going to learn how to deal with those kind of problems here. Let's multiply these two binomials very quickly. You should know how to do this now. I am multiplying a binomial times a binomial, so I will use FOIL. First term, 2 times 2 is 4. Outer terms, 2 times a negative radical 11 is a negative 2 radical 11. Inner terms, a positive 2 times a radical 11 is a positive 2 radical 11. And the last terms, a positive radical 11 times a negative radical 11 is a negative. Radical 11 times radical 11 is radical 121, which is just 11. We have some like terms, folks. Negative 2 radical 11 and a positive 2 radical 11, they will cancel out. Positive 4 and a negative 11, we're just adding or subtracting. In this case, subtracting, I will get negative 7. No radicals. Let's try another one. I have 5 plus radical 7 times 5 minus radical 7. First term, 5 times 5 is 25. Outer, 5 times a negative radical 7 is just a negative 5 radical 7. Inner terms will be a positive 5 radical 7. And the last terms, a positive times a negative, that would be a negative. Radical 7 times radical 7 is radical 49, which is just 7. We have some like terms. A negative 5 radical 7 and a positive 5 radical 7 will cancel out. 25 minus 7 will be simply 18. The radical is gone. We have a word for these binomials. We now have a binomial such as 2 plus radical 11. The word for 2 minus radical 11, we call them conjugates. So I'm just going to do one problem here. I know you can't believe that. So to rationalize this denominator, I have 5 over 2 plus radical 3. I cannot simply multiply it by radical 3 over radical 3. We have learned that that does not work. So I'm going to multiply it by the conjugate. What is the conjugate of 2 plus radical 3? It is 2 minus radical 3. But now I can't multiply by 2 minus radical 3 just because it's my birthday. And yes, you know, I stopped having those at 39. I'm going to multiply by 2 minus radical 3 over 2 minus radical 3. That's really just 1. And when you multiply anything times 1, you're not changing it. So that is what makes it okay. But be careful. Make sure that you put these binomials in parentheses so you'll know to use FOIL or distributive property. Let's get to work. In the numerator, I will just use distributive property. It's 5 times 2 minus radical 3. 5 times 2? Yes, that will be 10. 5 times a negative radical 3 will be a negative 5 radical 3. Okay, I'm going to work on the denominator. It's a binomial times a binomial. The first term, 2 times 2 is 4. The outer terms, 2 times a negative radical 3. The inner term is a positive 2 radical 3. They cancel out. That's what we learned about conjugates. The last terms, radical 3 times a negative radical 3 is a negative radical 9. But we know radical 9 is just 3. 4 minus 3 is just 1. So when I did FOIL on this binomial times a binomial, I just got 1. Anything over 1 I actually don't even need to write that denominator because anything over 1 is just itself. If this was over 2, I would have to leave it there. And we'll talk about if it was over 5 and we'd have to reduce it all. Well, we'll save that for another video.